Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for having me here at the conference. I specialize in historical sociology, and currently I'm writing a history of human societies, a world history, beginning at the origins of humanity. Yes, I'm moving into many different social sciences, and ending in the present. In this book, I trace the growth and increasing complexity of human societies, leading to the one global society that we have that is very incomplete at present. I have also been a student in the Arcane School for many years, and as Maria said, I think, I'm also very grateful for that, though I tend not to share that with my academic colleagues. I have applied what I have learned in the school to this exoteric world history for myself and in school papers. Taking the Tibetans' teachings as we talked, as a working hypothesis or a set of working hypotheses, and pondering how they work out in human history. In particular, I have been thinking about spiritual involution, the increasing involvement of the soul in the three worlds, while the Tibetans' works emphasize, he doesn't talk much about involution, he emphasizes evolution, which occurs after involution. I think of this evolutionary cycle carried out on the scale of humanity as a whole as a part of the understructure of the plan for humanity, and the plan for humanity is simply part of the plan for this whole planet. Thus, in the first half of this talk, I will trace out what I think is worldly evidence for the involution of humanity over the last few millennia. This provides background for my point, the spiritual implications of world history for our present and future situation. The Tibetan often says that the disciple only needs to know the constitution of man and the next step ahead. In this talk, I will trace out what I think has been the constitution of humanity so far and address some of what I think is the next step for humanity. I won't mention Shambhala or the hierarchy too much, though I'm very aware of them. And I'm going to have to leave it to the audience to ponder the keynote in relation to this address. I've been struggling with that for weeks. And I'll be bouncing back and forth between a very materialistic world history and referring to the Tibetans' works over and over. Please take what I say as working hypotheses, meant to stimulate our thinking on the plan. Okay, so to review what involution and evolution are, for most of you, but some might find it a new idea, Theosophists talk about a cycle or an arc divided into two great halves. The first half is involution, which is the spirit taking a succession of vehicles of expression in the material world. Spirit involves itself in matter more and more deeply until, as the Tibetan says, the lowest point is reached. The purpose is for spirit to build and develop appropriate forms in matter. The second half of this arc is evolution, the ascent or return of spirit to its source. The Tibetan says that the soul uses the gains of the evolutionary process. I have citations here. I'm not going to tell you where these things came from. We'll be here forever. These gains are the forms built during involution, and the forms allow the expression of spirit in the material world. Theosophists say this is a process true for a solar system, for a planet, presumably for a galaxy in the universe, and for a human being. And I know there's a long discussion of it in Blavatsky's works, which may or may not contradict some of what I say, but I'm sticking mostly with the Tibetan and with academic world history. Focusing on human beings, the idea is that the individual human spirit takes incarnation multiple times, repeatedly born into different physical bodies, and over many lifetimes, this being becomes more and more materialistic, experiencing all that the three worlds have to offer: money, power, sex, drugs, food, all increasingly selfish, oriented toward the self. That self is enveloped in Maya, or delusions about the physical material world, but the soul must often work to seek out these material experiences, and this effort and these experiences develop the human equipment, the physical, mental, and emotional bodies. Thus, strong emotions and complex intellectual experiences eventually become part of involution, though this means the soul is also enveloped in what the Theosophists call glamour and illusion. At some point, the soul has lived all possible experiences in the three worlds and starts to desire something more, initiating the path of spiritual evolution. We are familiar with this path, most of us, presumably, being on it, whether beginners or advanced, but it depends on completing spiritual involution. So much for the individual's path through this cycle. What about humanity as a whole? I think that world's history so far demonstrates the involution of humanity in the three worlds. Historically oriented social scientists have called this process social evolution, or human groups growing in size and complexity, not bodies, not souls, but groups of bodies. These have become larger and more complex over the last 15 to 20 millennia. While the secret doctrine offers a story of involution and evolution through root races, I would like to use worldly social science to lay out what I think is a plausible story of the involution of humanity so far. I would say that the growth and elaboration of societies parallels the development of the personality vehicles. Thus, this growth and complexity allowed humanity to become ever more materialistic, which I think was the outer manifestation of humanity following involution. Let us start with evolution. I know that is confusing. Social evolution is spiritual involution, but just stay with me for the moment. Let us start as anthropologists understand it. If we include all members of the genus Homo, the first humans developed 2 million years ago, a being that scientists call Homo erectus. There were other species of Homo, including Hergaster and Heidelbergensis, plus several species of, Kurt and I were talking about how people can't tell whether Neanderthals were Homo sapiens or not, and we're not even sure about Denisovans. There were many species before Homo sapiens sapiens. But that species developed in Africa between 200 and 300,000 years ago. And around 60,000 years ago, when that number is debated, humans spread into Europe and Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, finishing about 15,000 years ago. In other words, covering the planet. These human groups were all based on, at the time, hunting and gathering, which is what animals have always done, just finding food in their environments. That's what humans did. These groups experienced food uncertainty a good part of the time, and just as animals faced, also very high fertility and mortality rates compared to what we experience now. Women had up to, and this is debated, of course, 6 children in a lifetime, and an average of almost half of those died by the age of 20. About half your children dying, sometimes a third. Men generally hunted, women generally gathered, but this was very flexible, and groups camped and moved quite around a lot. With the end of the Pleistocene climate era, in which humanity evolved, and the start of the Holocene era, somewhere around 12 to 10,000 years ago, the surface of the planet became warmer and wetter. In a few places, humans started domesticating plants, changing plants to be dependent on humans, and humans then became dependent on those plants. This change allowed a nutritional and demographic change. People slowly, very slowly, but surely settled down and formed villages of 100 people or so, maybe a few hundred, some centuries later, and eventually thousands. All this happened over thousands of years. Each generation only noticed a very small change, as far as we know, from their parents' way of doing things. But cumulatively, this amounted to what prehistorians call the Neolithic or agricultural revolution. I would say that this acceleration in social change, and you mentioned acceleration yesterday, I think this started here around 10,000 years ago, counted as a step forward mentally for humans. They developed new technologies, new spiritualities, much more trade, and larger groups, which required keeping track of more relationships. Humans also started lumping individuals into their groups since groups were so large. Warfare also seems to have started, again, debated, in this period. There was always murder among groups, but not the kind of group-to-group fighting that we call warfare. Men almost always fighting men, which led to much more organized leadership, though that was still pretty informal, as was the real economic inequality that seems to have started in this period. This happened independently, that's important, in 6 places in the world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Mexico, and Peru. In the rest of the world, humans remained hunter-gatherers for a while. And as the centuries passed, this domestication independently happened in more places in North America, and New Guinea, and in West Africa. And in the meantime, the original 6 domesticating societies became larger and more complex, as I think this talk is becoming. Are you following everything that's going on? But that is partly the point. These new societies, which are called complex societies or chiefdoms, became fundamentally unfair, especially toward women, and they also developed slavery. I would say, looking from a spiritual point of view, these inequalities offered a wider range of human experiences to incarnating souls. About 5,000 years ago, societies in what we call the Middle East grew large and complex enough to be what historians call civilizations, and social scientists call states or empires. After some more millennia, this happened in those other 4 places. So it started, again, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then in India and China, and then a few thousand years later in Mexico and Peru, again, independently. Around 2,000 years ago in Mexico and Peru, give or take, and eventually in Africa also. They were based primarily on warfare and conquest and were very unequal. Popular culture usually focuses on elite issues in films and books, or in life in cities, both of which really did exist. But these fictional portrayals ignore the fact that most people in these empires lived very poor and desperate lives as farmers in small villages. Anybody gonna watch Game of Thrones tonight? Yeah, okay. Elites, not the average person. Again, however, souls in these societies, I think, found even more to stimulate them mentally and emotionally than previously. Trade expanded, putting people into contact with even more cultural groups. There was a great increase in elaboration, if you consider humanity as a whole, of techniques in the economy, in the arts, in philosophies, and in politics. Life, unfortunately, in some ways became more difficult. It seems, debated, that both fertility and mortality increased. Yes, even more babies than 6 per lifetime. Go ahead and ponder that if you're female. Due to diseases, warfare, and starvation, in addition to the increasingly terrible inequalities. Slavery also increased a great deal around the world. Empires often expanded by conquering and incorporating small-scale villages and hunter-gatherer societies, sometimes just wiping them out. Also, and I think this is important, empires went through a typical cycle of rapid expansion and then slow decline, which usually was violent and which usually took a few hundred years, longer than one human lifetime. New empires often built on the ruins of old ones, but not always, because empires tended eventually to use up the land through overplanting, deforestation, and salinization. That is, human societies destroying their environments is not a new story. I'm sorry to say. Interestingly, the Tibetan says something that acknowledges the inequalities existing in these societies and discipleship in the New Age. and I'm abbreviating the quote here, he says that all civilizations and cultures are externalizations of the potent, vibrating, and planned activity of the world initiates and disciples of the hierarchy at the time. Their disciples step down the inflowing energies, so that the thinkers and idealists can grasp these new emerging truths more accurately. And these change the consciousness of humanity as a whole and raises it. And he confirms this idea in another book also. Note how, in this quote, an inner spiritual elite has always led these societies, however materialistic these societies were. So around 500 years ago, from 5,000 to 500 years ago, there had been two major transformations in human life, the Neolithic Revolution and the development of complexity. But these two transformations did not include all societies on the planet. So this creates a tremendous diversity around the world. So there was a vast diversity of family systems, political structures, belief systems, artistic traditions, and economic and technical practices around the world among humans, offering a vast range, I would say, of experiences for incarnating human souls to continue the path of spiritual involution. Still, compared to today, and I will get to this, mental development was somewhat minimal. Sorry. The third major transformation started around 500 years ago in Europe. Europeans traveled around the world, famously putting Afro-Eurasia and the Americas in permanent contact, conquering most societies in the Americas by the year 1800, and conquering nearly all African and Asian societies a century later. Likewise, Europe transformed internally, developing the printing press and gradually becoming a set of literate societies, a new thing in world history, discovering a new scientific method, and questioning the structures of existing societies in what is called the Enlightenment, as Jean-Pierre mentioned yesterday. Starting the Industrial Revolution, which transformed humanity's relationship to the material world, massively increasing global trade, having democratic revolutions in the Americas and in France, which over a century led to what we could call democracy, certainly representative government, and experiencing a demographic transition, a great fall in mortality, a massive growth in population, and then a subsequent fall in fertility. So the transformation and global expansion of Europe has led to the unification of humanity. Many spiritually oriented people seem to think of this unification very idealistically, as I used to do. But empires before 500 years ago were based, as I said, primarily on violent conquest. And honestly, Europeans simply continued this tradition on a global scale. They also spread their internal transformation around the world in at least two ways. First, the European form of society was diffused as the European empires broke up in the middle and late 20th century, and the newly independent peoples formed what we call nation states. Not the best term, but that's what we say. Also, Europeans and their descendants in the Americas continue to spread what they call economic development, currently in the form of industrial capitalism. The consequences have been the construction of a global social system, still very incomplete as yet, but one that unites humanity, though not in a particularly spiritual way. Academic scholars debate how Europe did this, and it's one of the most contentious debates in the social sciences. They offer a lot of different explanations, though nobody accepts explanations of racial superiority. We chose Europe because they're white. Nobody accepts that. The Tibetan doesn't accept that. But those of us who study inner causes would suggest that it was the result of hierarchical activity. The Tibetan says that in two conclaves, in the year 1400 and 1500, the masters decided to attempt an integration of thought within humanity. They saw the coming Aquarian Age and wanted to prepare humanity for it, to elevate its consciousness to the mental plane and to break down barriers between peoples. The Tibetan says that the Renaissance, the Elizabethan poets, artistic schools, the French Revolution, all grew out of this activity. And he also says that in 1725, in another such gathering, they decided to hasten the entry of a particular group of souls into incarnation. And as the Tibetan says, quote, the civilization of modern times came into being, unquote. Which this included great political movements, reaction against religious dogmatism, the development of science, proletarian revolutions, and other changes. And it's interesting that a lot of historians and social scientists say that the really transformative changes happened after 1750, about 25 years after this conclave. In any case, we now live in a world made by 3 long-term historical transformations. 2 spread partly throughout the world, 1 completely enveloping it. So much for the causes of the transformation of humanity. What have been the spiritual results? First, this last change has widened the range of human experiences for incarnating souls, I would say, even more. One can starve to death in one lifetime and be a billionaire in the next. The Industrial Revolution and economic development have made possible a great increase in lifespan, and that has spiritual implications. As mentioned, for almost all of human history, about half of all children, on the average, varying around the world, died by the age of 20, 25. Now most people on this planet live into their 70s. Souls that I think never lived an entire lifetime in many lifetimes, and there were probably many like that given the death rate, can now do so. Also, nearly every child on this planet that is eligible for school is in school. This is very new in the last 10 to 20 years, and becoming literate in some language. This is a first in human history, leading, I think, to the mental stimulation of all humans in a way never before seen. Likewise, participation in mass politics, social and mass media, are stimulating minds and emotions in entirely new ways. This leads to a lot of glamour and illusion, but it still leads to the development of emotional and mental vehicles on a mass scale. Still, I would say that these changes have in general increased materialism and the emphasis on worldly experiences. The Tibetan has even said that right now the trend in humanity is for ever more separation and selfishness. I really looked for this quote. I remember reading it, and then I couldn't find it for the paper. On the other hand, he says, in another place, that synthesis is the main trend today, and everything is working toward amalgamation, larger blocks, international relationships, economic interdependence, and so on. So the Tibetan says that humanity is becoming ever more separative and becoming ever more synthetic. In other words, there are both trends and counter-trends at present, which is a very unstable situation. And I think that anyone who follows the news these days might conclude that we are indeed in an unstable global situation. It is worth noting that the wave of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism spreading around the world, it's not just in North America or Western Europe, is the symptom of something much deeper. Its appearance is not the work of a day, but of decades. I want to suggest that the instability we see, which is only now becoming obvious, is because we are collectively at the inflection point of the evolutionary cycle. This is my suggestion. That is, in the last century or so, and for the next century or two, humanity as a whole is making the turn from worldly involution to spiritual evolution. If so, at any given time, billions are still on the very materialistic path of involution, and billions are very early in their spiritual evolution. I think that these two clusters within humanity work against each other, obviously unconsciously, and this is the source of instability. As the Tibetan says, our period is simply one in which human selfishness has come to its climax and must either destroy humanity or be brought intelligently to an end. And selfishness is, of course, one of the hallmarks of an involved soul. So at the beginning, I quoted the Tibetan to the effect that the disciple only needs to know the constitution of man and the next step ahead, and I extended this idea to humanity. So far, I have laid out the development of the constitution of humanity. Exoterically, we are constituted by nation states, very diverse. Some are rich, some are middle income, many are still poor. There is a global economy, a structure of global governance, not global government, but global governance, a tremendous flow of ideas around the world, great inequalities of race and gender, a lengthening lifespan, and a new and, I would say, mostly destructive relationship with the subhuman kingdoms on this planet. Esoterically, I've suggested we're at this inflection point in this cycle, so that many are on the path, many remain in Maya, illusion, and glamour. Even if the majority have made the turn, I would say that most humans are pretty early on the path. I don't think that the world is filled with third and fourth degree initiates yet. So what about the other half of my analogy? What is the next step ahead for humanity? I've had a terrible time writing the second half of this paper because I don't know. And really, nobody does. My reading of history convinces me that humans have always made it up as they went along. Even the Tibetans said, if I remember correctly, that the hierarchy made plans to abandon ship, so to speak, during the Second World War when things weren't looking all that good. And yet, here we are, anticipating and possibly experiencing the externalization of the hierarchy. So we're all making it up as we go along. If my idea is correct, then this inflection point is a tremendous point of tension within humanity. Note that the structure of global society was built as most humans were getting more and more involved in the three worlds. By doing this, we have created several problems that need solving. And I would say solving these problems constitutes the next step ahead. And many of these problems are full of contradictions or perhaps seeming contradictions. If you like, you can take this as a partial updating of problems of humanity, which I'm now realizing is kind of arrogant of me, but I'm just going to go on. One danger is global inequality of many sorts. And a very obvious kind of inequality is gender inequality. Remember hunter-gatherers? They're generally known to be gender equal, roughly. And this equality started to erode in the Neolithic, got much worse under the warfare of chiefdoms and states. Things are starting to improve, but there's a long way to go. There are also racial and ethnic inequalities. Most humans have been suspicious of outsiders for thousands of years. And right now, the rich and powerful countries define outsiders as darker skinned, which, by the way, is the bulk of humanity. And a third kind of inequality is economic. Development is taking far longer than social scientists optimistically predicted in the 1950s and 60s. Yet, in some places, capitalist economic growth is helping lift people out of poverty, especially absolute poverty, in which one's life is at stake. Yes, people still starve to death on this planet every day. To death. Thus, capitalist economic growth is a good thing. Unfortunately, capitalist economic growth pretty much always increases economic inequality. So it is also a bad thing. As I said, contradictions. It is easy to blame rich, greedy elites who keep getting richer at everyone else's expense. And as a sociologist, believe me, I could go on and on and on about rich, greedy elites. Oh boy. But I have to say that many people in the rich countries of the global north, even some of the better-to-do poor and certainly the middle classes, are complicit in our way of life. We live materially much better lives because of the socioeconomic structures that big corporations have set up around the world. However, this materially rich life has set up another problem. Global warming is only the most obvious environmental problem. For nearly all human history, we have had a generally, I would say, generally negative effect on the physical world. So climate change is a logical consequence of there being billions more of us multiplied by our industrial capitalist technology. But we are actually facing multiple environmental disasters right now, using up many resources such as arable land and water. Deforestation is not only accelerating global warming, but destroying the land at a major rate, along with salinization from farming and pollution in the oceans and on the land. Capitalism may be reducing the number of people starving to death, and it is, but it is slowly destroying the surface of this earth. Changes in global economic inequality have other effects only perceivable by studying long-term world history. Some historical scientists have suggested that there are cycles of hegemony, or the concentration of power in one country and then the decline of that power over time, to be replaced by a new power. These cycles, if you believe this theory, seem to last just over 100 years, again, longer than one human lifetime. And the decline of one global power tends to be followed by a period of no particular country being in charge, which tends to lead to the global war and then a new power. If these scholars knew about the Tibetan, they would agree with him that World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II were pretty much one war between the alliances started by the United States and by Germany, and we know how those wars turned out. However, the Napoleonic Wars also qualify, a contest between England, Britain, and France. And if we go back another 100 years, the various wars of succession in Europe also seem to qualify. Unfortunately, right now we seem to be in that rather chaotic period where there is no one global power in charge. The current world power, the United States, is turning inward, while other countries are rapidly getting richer, especially China. Given the existence of nuclear weapons, or for that matter, cyber warfare, the stakes are high. I know, it's a really happy talk. The three other problems are demographic shrinkage, believe it or not, that's a problem, artificial intelligence, and social isolation, but I'm happy to talk about them in questions. In any case, I would say that solving the problems that we have created through our ever-deepening involvement in the three worlds is the next step ahead. I also want to emphasize that solving these problems offers spiritual opportunities. The extension of lifespan and the consequent increase in opportunities in experiences offer all these souls who are still on the involutionary path the chance to experience everything the world has to offer, speeding up their turn toward evolution. Likewise, mass media and social media allow souls the opportunity to observe others' experiences vicariously. Perhaps that will turn certain people to social evolution, spiritual evolution also. And since economic development is ending the kind of poverty that leads to starvation to death, an experience in which almost, I think, nobody can be spiritual except maybe one of the masters, that offers other opportunities. Also, in Problems of Humanity, the Tibetans said, behind all modern wars lies a fundamental economic problem. Solve that, and wars will very largely cease. He develops the economic problem by saying there is no justifiable excuse for the lack of essentials in life in any part of the world. And he attributes it to national or group selfishness and says it's really a problem of distribution. Many people have said that since then. And one could say it's a distribution of techniques and ways to grow economically, which the global north isn't necessarily spreading either. Interestingly, capitalist democracies generally do not make war on each other. This is something that puzzles political scientists. This is something that's published a lot in political science. Why do democracies not fight each other over the last few decades? Could we get to the point that all societies are at least reasonably wealthy democracies with large social safety nets? I think this would really be another huge spiritual opportunity. And climate change is also a spiritual opportunity. It is a collective action problem, as social scientists put it, and it is a way for humanity to unify. to act collectively as a whole. Of course, there are groups that selfishly don't care about the problem, mostly in the United States, but younger Americans in all groups and parties agree that climate change is a problem and they want to solve it. At least younger people do. The question, of course, is whether we will solve it in time, but that is the opportunity. Considering that our industrial way of life affects species in the 4 or 5 kingdoms of nature, that's what biologists say now, not 3 kingdoms, this is an opportunity to learn about and change humanity's relations with those subhuman kingdoms. And I would also say the lengthening of lifespan, the reduction in fertility is a tremendous opportunity for half of humanity, the lowering of fertility. There are so many more opportunities for women around the world because of it. And people can live longer lives, as I've mentioned, and experience much more. So, I will close. Yes, I really will. In less than 5 minutes. One might wonder what our responsibilities as servers are. I would like to offer some, I don't know if this is lessons or advice or conclusions I've drawn from writing this paper and writing this book, but I'm just going to offer them. First, let's not lose hope. What happens in North America and Western Europe may or may not be the most important thing happening in humanity. Stated differently, studying world history over the long term has shown me that many historical cycles or patterns last much longer than one human lifetime. So it is very easy to be deluded by immediate local events, however widely you define your locale, rather than trends that last many decades across the entire planet, even if there are rather catastrophic experiences. Okay, here's the keynote. Even if there's a lot of destruction, there will be some sort of resurrection. Second, avoid cynicism. My approach in writing this world history has been institutional political economy. That's the idea that those with the wealth make the rules for everyone else. In other words, show me the money is a good way to understand human societies. If human history has been so far the path of involution, materialism, and selfishness, then cynicism is actually a reasonable way to understand society so far. However, if humanity really is collectively making the turn to spiritual evolution, then materialism and cynicism lose their ability to help us understand what is happening in humanity. As the number of souls on the evolutionary path increases, more and more people will have altruistic spiritual motives. And finally, I think it is very important to remember, this occurred to me once in a reappearance, the Thursday meditation. Nobody's coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. The Tibetan says in esoteric psychology, the plans for humanity are not laid down, for humanity determines its own destiny. The Tibetans' works repeatedly express this point. I could have gotten another 2 or 3 quotes like this. That individual people and humanity as a whole are free to make their own path. In the 20th century, the hierarchy made plans to, quote, make possible a closer relationship between humanity and the hierarchy, unquote. And indeed, the Tibetan wrote a whole book about this. So the masters will walk among us again, or perhaps are. The Christ will come and teach. Will anyone listen? The masters do not come to control humanity. They will simply show us the way. We must be the ones to actually walk that way. They can't carry us. That is, after all, what spiritual evolution is about. We do the work, and it is the work that transforms us spiritually. The great ones are already transformed. It is up to humanity, it's up to us to take that next step. Thank you.